Hello, and welcome to the City of Truth. Episode 2, Foundations. Last time, we talked about laying the foundations needed to work toward my beautiful idea. I border on obsessive when it comes to clarity, so today we're going to delve even deeper into that foundation. A small error at the beginning of our thinking will lead to big errors later on, as Aristotle says. And remember, our big goal here at the foundation is to build a model that can keep science intact. I've decided to label our model the common sense model. I call it this because it's built on those most fundamental assumptions that determine how we live. They're the kind of assumptions that everyone from the Bronze Age Egyptian farmers to 21st century Chinese lawyers consider obvious, so much so that they never really even question them. Acceptance of science is our shorthand for this. As we talked about in episode 1, that means we accept that there's a world out there, that our perceptions reflect reality, and that we can communicate ideas. Later on, I'll get much more explicit about just which assumptions will go into the common sense model. For now, though, we need to wrap up our groundwork on how we will assess objects in the world. I want to go over some of the concepts used in philosophy, but I want to describe them without using all the funky terms that normally trip people up. 2.1. Property sets. The scientific method uses observations about the world, obviously, so we need to understand how to consider those observations. We look out at a star. Let's say we want to know more about it. What does it mean to know? Well, we have to know the material it's made of, mostly hydrogen, and then its configuration as well. The more complicated the object, the more the configuration part matters. You could have a large dog and a small human with exactly the same amounts of each element in them, or pretty close at least, but their configuration renders them pretty different. We can call this, and any other essential data, the set of properties. So that's at least two different things we need to know, the material and its set of properties. Even for the carbon in an apple, you still have to know more than just the material. It could instead be a diamond or a lump of coal or graphite. There's a lot of properties to know before you can say you really know everything about an object. So for each object, we need to know its material and its property set. The set is information and not immediately physical. This set of properties is held by our mind. If there is an accurate correspondence between the set of properties in the thing itself and the set in our mind, then it's fair to say we know the thing. Our knowledge can be inexact or contain errors, obviously, but this correspondence really is the thing we mean by knowledge. Once we have a number of these sets, we can start to see patterns. The object in my hand and the one on that tree have similar property sets. These correspondences lead us to broader categories. We can then label it an apple. We can then leave the properties of this one object and move into the common properties of all objects like it. Call it a set category if you like. But most complex communication we engage in relates to these set categories. We don't talk so much about this apple as about apples. There are, moreover, what you could call critical properties in those objects, as well as non-critical. A critical property is that which must be known about an object, or it's not fair to say that you know the object. So if you think red is a property of all apples, you'd be wrong, but you'd still know what an apple is. If you think apples can talk, then you pretty clearly don't get what an apple is. What constitutes the work of our mind then, or at least a great deal of it, is making these mental categories. For any of this to be more than just a mental game, however, we absolutely have to accept that our minds really are getting accurate data from our experiences. We can grant occasional exceptions, but those exceptions should be distinguishable from most ordinary experiences. If not, then we can't trust the info coming in, and we can't trust the conclusions coming out. Therefore, science is bunk. That's not an acceptable conclusion to us. We have to actually know things as they are in the world, at least in their critical properties. There has to be a correspondence between what the word apple means in our heads and the actual properties that apples possess out there, independent of us. 2.2. Why do ideas work? And this is where it starts to get weird, because now we have a problem. Objects out in the world contain these sets of properties. They also contain the material they're made of. In our heads, that's not the case. This is pure information. There's not an actual apple in our heads. The weird part, though, is that there's such a thing called apples at all. We got there by seeing a bunch of stuff and their correlations. Then we made a mental model of it and labeled it apple. Great. But do apples exist outside of our minds? I don't mean individual objects. I mean the category apple. If you say no, then we aren't in the realm of knowledge at all when we talk about apples. Or anything, really. It's absurd to say that binary stars have property X, for instance, because there's no such thing as the category binary stars. That's something we made up for shorthand. And we just broke science again. We broke language, too. All communication is based on these group categories. And just as importantly, these objects really do appear to correlate with each other. We make the category because it seems to be how the world works. And a person who has those categories is at least functionally more informed about the world than someone without them. For example, mathematics is pure abstraction. We don't go out into the wild and study the number 2 in its natural habitat, snatching it up with a Pokeball. It's an abstraction, a category set. But the mathematically literate have a better understanding of the world than those who don't get math. They can make better predictions. They can analyze things and make useful stuff like an iPhone. It works. Our mental categories work. This is what Eugene Wigner called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. There's a correlation here. Countless times, mathematicians have just played math games without any connection to the real world, and then centuries later, it turns out it's super useful and explains something in the real world. We can only resolve this seeming paradox by saying that our mental categories are real. They really exist. The whole issue is sometimes called the problem of universals, though I've dragged some additional baggage into it as well. But the big question is whether the categories we build in our mental models are real things, or just something we've made up for convenience. And I think it's fair to say that the success of science ought to settle the debate. The entire enterprise is that of the triumph of our mental categories, our ability to use something as abstract as wave functions and imaginary numbers and Fourier transforms to figure out how we can trick light into acting like a laser. The connection between our mental categories and their utility in discovering new things about the world is, I think, undeniable. So what does that mean, then? How do these categories exist? Well, we have a few possibilities, but we won't go too deep into this until much later. The first is what the philosopher Plato proposed. There's a separate, non-physical world where things like the number 7 exist. The number 7 is just its own thing hanging out in another reality. Super weird stuff. It's called the world of forms. There are actually a few philosophers around today who still hold to the concept in a modified form. The big problem there is about relationships. How do the forms relate to each other? And how do they relate to our world? Are there forms that relate forms to forms? How far does that go? How does this chunk of matter know to be an apple? Who's telling it to do that? To go check the realm of forms and pick that one? And how do we access it? And wouldn't it seem that we don't actually learn about apples by studying individual apples, but by some other power that goes off to this land of forms and grabs the apple set? It's a pretty far out idea. The second possibility is that they exist, but only in two modes, as objects in the ordinary world and in minds. That way, you don't need to speculate about a realm of forms. It appears to be simpler, on the face of it at least. This is Aristotle's view, but it also presents a problem. Let's take math again. We're saying that math exists in the world and in minds. But let's say the entire universe just blinked out of existence one Tuesday. Would math still be true? It would seem so. But there's no universe and no minds. So how is it still true? Things like mathematical truths appear to be necessarily true. They'd be true even if nothing else ever existed. You don't have to check if there's a material world out there to confirm mathematical proofs. The final option is that the above view of Aristotle is correct, but that there's also some sort of ultimate mind out there that must necessarily exist and holds these forms. That mind can't go out of existence, so math is still true even without the universe existing. I think it's fair to paint that as a sort of theism. It's not more specific than that, but a sort of supermind that knows all the things? That's definitely entering God territory. The Platonic view has problems. The Aristotle view you can get away with if you either say that math stops being true if we disappear, or, alternatively, the universe must always exist. There's something necessary about the universe. The third seems to propose some sort of God as a solution. That's only a problem if the concept of a god is unacceptable for other reasons. Here's where I'll let some of my biases color the question. I don't think the Platonic view is tenable at all. A world of forms is a strange thing to propose in the first place, and the relationship issue is, I think, insurmountable. The view of Aristotle and the ultimate mind view are at least potentially consistent, but we will leave that for another time. Nevertheless, if you grant that our mental categories are real, and that therefore we really do know things about the world, that science is true, then you're stuck with one of these options. 2.3. Ideas and Science. At this point you might be wondering something. Why is this never talked about if it's so foundational to science? Well, good question, myself. Thank you, self. The first is about methodology. So long as we're all accepting some form of the ground rules, even just as unspoken assumptions, the methods of science and its results don't actually require us to iron out all these details. That doesn't mean they're not important. Think of it like voting. You don't need to know the philosophical underpinnings of a modern representative democracy to go vote. You could just go do that, and the system will buzz right along. But you better hope someone ironed it out at some level, explaining the underlying reasons why it should be supported, and considered checks and balances, and has considered reasons why the system ought to be somewhat stable, and ways to detect fraud, and so on. If no one is laying the groundwork, then it could all easily come crashing down. But each voter doesn't need to do that. Or maybe it's the difference between using a smartphone and knowing electrical engineering or programming. You don't need that knowledge to use your phone. Likewise, each scientist operates within a pre-existing framework of science, its principles and its habits. It's good to know how and why we should accept it, but it's not essential to science as a process. Only the broadest questions or theories ever require you to even consider it. Most of the time, scientific interpretation takes place deep within the existing framework. Another reason is that there are differing interpretations even of these most basic principles, so everyone can just sort of gloss over it and agree that, roughly, this is what we're all going for. And there are variants that are perhaps unacceptable on a philosophical level, but don't really create a problem on a practical one. Let's take David Hume, for instance. He says that the principle of causality isn't really a first principle, or the product of deduction. Instead, it's just our common experience. But in his mind, there's nothing illogical about, say, a duck spontaneously appearing in your bathtub. Now, not only is that wrong, but also it's deeply contrary to every rational method of consideration we have. And not only that, but if true, it really does call into question the very idea of scientific knowledge. Sure, we saw Jupiter go around the sun for the 11 millionth time, but what if it were a mere coincidence, and there's nothing causal there? Maybe tomorrow, Jupiter's just gonna check out. And what's worse, some things about the world have no causal relationship, which means there is no explanation for them. According to Hume, stuff can just appear at times. We find a duck on Mars one day. No reason. The end. Gravity pulls down everyone's car, except yours, so you float off into space. Just happens sometimes. Hope you have good insurance. Even without diving in, that's pretty obviously incorrect. You could say causality is just an inductive position if you like, but it's had a 100% success rate so far. But of course, practically speaking, no one thinks that way. I doubt even Hume did. In fact, the principle of causality is all over his work. So one can be a practical scientist and an admirer of Hume, despite the fact that the two really don't mesh well. The same goes for Kant. His notion of how ideas work permanently separates the real world from our mind. Every scientist in the world better hope Kant is wrong, or they've just been twiddling their thumbs. Yet I'm sure there are scientists who love Kant. It's incredibly easy for the world of big ideas to remain separate from our ordinary lives. Most people don't live consistently and intentionally according to their deeply held beliefs. Sam Harris may not believe in free will, but he sure acts like he does, doesn't he? And we've all heard of people who don't practice what they preach. My personal favorite is when someone who doesn't believe the outside world exists, apart from within our own minds, writes about it. Who do you think you're writing to? We all do this, more or less. I think it's fair to say that we should strive to live rationally and consistently with our worldview. A third factor is that science is fundamentally quantitative. It's about numbers, or rather, about specifically measurable quantities and consistent predictions. It's about the kind of data that you could put into a computer. There's no question that that's incredibly useful and important, but it's also clear that that sort of information isn't all there is. How do you engage in a quantitative analysis of whether these category sets exist according to a Platonic, Aristotelian, or theistic worldview? You can't. It's a different type of thing. You can even find ways to approximate things like this with numbers, but there is a difference between the approximation and the reality. To take a famous example, if you had read everything there is to know about seeing color, but you were colorblind, would you encounter something new if one day you could see color? Yes. Seeing color is fundamentally different than reading about it. Determining these first principles and understanding what knowledge really means is pre-science. It's the ground on which science stands. Some might object here as well. Scientific truth is all there is, they'd say. Some people believe that. It's actually a non-scientific statement, though. Science doesn't tell us that there are only scientific truths, so it's a self-contradicting view. I think we can all agree that a self-contradictory view is unacceptable and false on just those grounds alone. Again, that isn't an attack on science, just on the view that we can't hold anything as true which is not the product of the scientific process. The most die-hard fans of science hold non-scientific things to be true. And that's not a criticism. It's good. We're supposed to do that. I think the fundamental misunderstanding here is that people often use scientific as a synonym for rational. The two aren't the same thing, though. Science is a type of rational thought, but it's not all rational thought. Math, logic, philosophy, most of history, these can be supremely rational, but aren't scientific. Truth is the object of our pursuit. Truth. And there is nothing that limits truth to the scientific domain alone. Truth is broad and built on the sound foundations of rational thought. We must accept that non-scientific truths exist, and these are, at the very least, the truths necessary to support science. Our common sense model allows us to avoid the trap of all-consuming doubt that ensnares so many philosophers by accepting our fundamental perceptions, the ones we use every day in our life, without compromising our adherence to rationality. If there is any road to truth, surely it must take this form. Quote, "Who truth pursues, who from false ways his heedful steps would keep, by inward light must search within, in meditation deep. All outward bent he must repress, his soul's true treasure to possess. Then all that errors mist obscured shall shine more clear than light. This fleshly frame's oblivious weight hath quenched not reason quite. The germs of truth still lie within, whence we, by learning, all may win. Else how could ye the answer do, untaught to questions give, were it not that deep within the soul truth's secret sparks do live?" Boethius. I know this has been some pretty heavy stuff, but that's okay. Next week we'll take a little break and focus on some lighter fare, like, I don't know, the meaning of life. Simple stuff like that. Should be a fun time.